Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this Education Writers Association webinar on how arts education can help students and schools recover. Now I'm going to hand it over to today's web moderator, Isabel Sofia Dieppe. Take it away, Isabel.
Thank you, Stacia. Hello and welcome everyone to our panel, How Arts Education Can Help Students and Schools Recover, presented by the Education Writers Association. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Isabel Sofia Dieppe, and I'm an engagement education reporter at the Fresno Bee newspaper. To say the past year was challenging is an understatement. Parents and students suffered as the entire world grappled with the coronavirus pandemic. COVID-19 affected every part of our lives, socially, economically, and the physical and mental health of our communities. Of course, these problems and more have seeped into our students' lives and education. As schools are opening nationwide, educators and educational leaders are seeking different types of help for students to help to heal and prioritize learning. No doubt the arts will play a vital role in the healing and bringing together of communities. Our discussion today will be looking at how districts can tap into the arts to help rebuild school communities. We're going to look at concrete ideas for arts educators utilize to re-engage students, and what silver lining innovations the pandemic may have sparked in delivering arts education that might have staying power. Our panelists today are Jamie Casper, Director at Arts Education Partnership, Ruth Mercado Zizzo, Vice President of Programs and Equity at Edvestors, and Michael Powers, Music Department Chair at the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts. Let's dive right in. Jamie, I would love to start with you. Schools will be receiving billions of dollars in federal money due to the coronavirus pandemic. Although the funding is temporary, how can schools utilize these funds to create sustainable arts programs?
Yes, thanks, Isabel. Great, I have some slides that I'm going to share, so give me just a second to get that set up. Let's see, oh, hang on. This is where the screen real estate gets really fun. I minimized everything so that I could see my notes, and now I can't actually see the thing that I need to show, so give me 2 seconds. All righty, there we go. Now you should be able to see it. Okay, great. So as Isabel mentioned, my name is Jamie Casper. I'm the director of the Arts Education Partnership, and wanted to talk to you today about ESSER and arts education. So first thing I want to do is to share a little bit about the organization I work for. The Arts Education Partnership, or I'm going to call it AEP throughout this presentation, believes that arts and education leaders do better work when they're connected to powerful information and resources. Every day we connect our partners who are passionate about arts learning to the knowledge and people that help them do great things. And we do this because well-informed leaders are crucial to ensuring that learners have access to an excellent arts education. AEP is part of Education Commission of the States. They're an organization that supports state policymakers by providing connection opportunities and information centered on education policy. AEP was created 26 years ago by our two federal partner agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Department of Education. And over the past 26 years, we've grown to a network of over 130 partner and affiliates working at the local, state, and national levels on both school-based and community-based arts and education. And Edvestors, you're going to hear from Ruth in just a minute. Edvestors is one of our partner organizations. I'd like to take just a moment to share some of our most recent work so you have some context for the information that follows. One of our annual work products is ArtScan. This is a database that tracks 15 policy areas related to arts education. Twice a year, we facilitate a peer review and add studies to our arts education research database. We publish new posts on our blog at least twice a month. We've published recent posts from staff members, partners, and affiliates, and in a completely accidental coincidence, the post that we published today was actually written by Ruth. Some examples of our most recent publications include a report on the arts and juvenile justice, a piece compiling research on dance education, a report on the arts in charter schools, and a resource reflecting on the past 25 years of AEP. And finally, before I segue into information about ESSER funding and arts education, I want us to be clear about definitions. So the funding we're going to be talking about does focus on K-12 schools, but it's important for us to remember that arts learning happens across many different settings with many different types of educators facilitating that learning, and ESSER funding has a role in supporting all of those different kinds of learning. I also want to draw your attention to that final definition of core content areas. In federal legislation, the arts are included as a core content area, but we hear people use that term a lot as a synonym for tested content areas. So at AEP, we're very careful to say core content areas, including the arts, so that we're using that term correctly, or instead we'll say well-rounded education, since that's the term that's used in the latest federal education legislation. So we'll keep that in mind as we move along. And speaking of moving along, now that we have some broader context, let's dig into ESSER funding. ESSER stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, and I'm sure you know the basics by now. From 3 federal funding packages, $190 billion, that's with a B, dollars will be going to states, school districts, and charter schools from now through 2024. This amounts to about $3,700 for every student in the country. And to put this into perspective, that amount is equal to 25% of the total K-12 spending from all sources, federal, state, and local, in 2019. So people have been using words like historic or once in a generation to describe this federal investment in education. And the final important piece of information is the way that the funds are flowing. They are being allocated to the Department of Education at the federal level, going to state education agencies or departments of education, and then finally down to school districts. And after all of that happens, those local school districts are going to see about 90% of that $190 billion. Again, billion with a B. I don't get to say that number very often, so I'm gonna keep saying it. School districts are required to submit plans to the U.S. Department of Education for that funding. And they've really been wrestling with how they're going to align their plans for that money with goals for their children. So earlier I mentioned Arts Ed Search. We know from research that arts education benefits students in many ways. So first of all, it makes them better artists. And by that I mean it makes them better at seeing, at hearing, at moving their bodies, at using materials to create. Arts education also improves children's self-regulation, helps them to connect and relate to others, improves their skill in expressing their ideas and responding to the ideas of others, and makes them more aware of and excited to participate in the world around them. When I think about what children have not had the chance to do over the past 16 months, this is the list that I think about. And these are exactly the skills that schools might choose to focus on in their efforts to help their students process trauma and recover from the pandemic. So if these goals are important, arts education is a key to meeting them, then the question becomes, how can ESSER funds support arts education and therefore those goals? What's allowed and what's not? Before I give you that list, I want to share this great resource. This is where I got a lot of this information. This is a toolkit created by the National Association for Music Education, also one of AEP's partners. While the toolkit does focus specifically on music education, many of the strategies and recommendations also apply to those other arts disciplines that we looked at in the definition slide. All right, here's the list. ESSER funds can be used for 15 fundable activities. First fundable activity is anything that's already authorized by various pieces of education legislation. Anything that's already authorized under the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Perkins Act that governs career and technical education, and a whole bunch of other pieces of legislation, that's fundable. A second activity is coordination between local education agencies and other agencies to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID. Resources for school leaders to address needs in their individual school buildings. addressing unique needs of low-income students, students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, and other populations. Developing procedures and systems for schools to be more prepared and ready to respond to a pandemic. Sanitation and safety training and professional development for staff, and then in a related item, sanitation and cleaning supplies. Coordination of services. This is a broad category, but this includes things like meals, online learning, things that aren't necessarily directly instruction related. Educational technology and equipment for students, mental health services and supports, summer and after school programs, which we'll come back to in just a bit, addressing learning loss, facility repairs and improvements to better address the pandemic, improving indoor air quality, and then the last one, which is other activities necessary to maintain services and continue to employ existing staff. We know that there are unique safety challenges in arts classrooms. So I'm a musician, for example. When I play my flute, I am pulling a lot of air out of my lungs and dispelling it into the room, which is not necessarily happening, for example, in a social studies classroom. In a theater, the same thing is happening. In visual arts, students are sharing supplies. You know, you may see 8 classes in a day, and you're constantly reusing paintbrushes, markers, paper. In dance, we have, you know, people that need to be within 3 feet of each other in order to engage in the art form. So ways that districts might use ESSER funding to both attend to those unique safety challenges and just support arts education in general might be things like purchasing safety equipment, things like special masks for singers or masks for instrumentalists, extra art supplies so that students don't need to share or so that you have time to sanitize in between classes. Could also be things like teacher training. How do I safely teach in an arts classroom? Or how do I, for example, teach a dance class when half of my dancers are in the room with me and half of the dancers are online? I would have no idea how to teach that way. And I know that a lot of our teachers are struggling with that as well. Maintaining staff positions. So Chalkbeat and the Associated Press estimated 2% drop in student enrollment over the next year. That's more than 500,000 students. And this is important because when enrollment drops, school districts are really looking to cut staff positions to account for that. And you know, sometimes the arts programs either get cut down or get cut completely. And just like you wouldn't want to take a year off from reading instruction and then expect children to pick up where they left off, you can't expect a child to pick up an instrument or engage in theater after a year away from instruction. So maintaining those staffing levels is really important. And then another possibility for that ESSER funding is arts-based summer or after-school learning programs. And to wrap up, I wanted to share with you this report that just came out last week. This was written by Terry Peterson and Deborah Lowe Vandell. It highlights some of the evidence base that shows how well-designed and well-delivered summer enrichment and comprehensive after-school programs, including arts-based programs, can address learning loss, accelerate learning, and expand opportunities for student success. So I'll wrap up by reminding you that arts education is going to be extremely important in helping children recover from the pandemic, and the ESSER funding can help support those programs. Isabel, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That is that's very insightful. I know that a lot of the journalists who are tuning in will probably want to get some of those notes after we're done. I know this is being recorded, so anyone who's watching this who would like to go back can watch it on the EWA website, I believe. Next, I would like to move on to Ruth. I understand that your organization, Advestors, commissioned a study on the impact of arts expansion in Boston Public Schools. Can you tell us a little more about Advestors and the results of this study?
Yes, thank you so much, Isabel, for having me, and thank you to the Education Writers Association for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually going to share my screen, so hopefully you all can see a presentation now on your screen. Thank you. You can access a copy of this presentation that has links embedded to it. It should be in your chat window if you wanted to refer back to this later. Just a little bit about myself and Edvestors, the Boston-based education nonprofit where I work. Edvestors is an education nonprofit that began in 2002. We're nearly 20 years old, and our mission is to advance equitable, meaningful education that prepares every Boston student to activate their power and shape their future. We do this in a number of ways, primarily working with Boston Public Schools. We really work in partnership in terms of activating people and resources with all levels of stakeholders, whether they are funders, students, teachers, school leaders, principals, and everybody in between. We also look at really influencing system-wide change. We focus at looking at things on a systems level. How can districts serve students in the best way possible? What are the ecosystems that we're involved with that affect how students receive a meaningful education and activate their power? And we also look at being flexible and adapting to current contexts and learning and iterating as we go based on what we've learned. I've been at Edvestors for almost 10 years, and one of our primary focus areas is arts education. And it's important to note that we also have focus areas on math and equitable and relevant culturally responsive math education for students, on career pathways, and on really looking at more recently racial equity and how schools can build a racial equity lens into everything they do in their individual school buildings. And we also award every fall something called the School on the Move Prize, which is a $100,000 award given to one of the most improving schools in Boston Public Schools over a number of measures over a number of years. I'm going to go to the next slide and just talk a little more deeply about Boston Public Schools, or BPS Arts Expansion, which is a multi-year public-private partnership whose goal is to increase access to equitable arts education for all of Boston Public School students. It started in 2008, 2009. It was originally meant to be a 3-year effort, but here we are 12 years later, still working on arts education because of the success and the willingness of all the parties involved to continue building on the progress that we've made. And those partners happen to be everybody from the City of Boston and Boston Public Schools primarily, to a funder collaborative, to higher ed institutions, to arts and culture organizations throughout the city, teachers and students. And the main goals of BPS Arts Expansion are around expanding school-based arts instruction, building district and school capacity to support quality arts education for students, and ensuring long-term sustainability by building broad ownership, meaning that arts education is something that is not just owned by those who are practicing artists or arts teachers, but that it really becomes something, as Jamie said when she was discussing AAP and their work, that arts is integral to every part of a student's well-rounded education, and that it is core content. So if I'm going to go to the next slide and just give a little background of why was Edvestors interested in arts education back in 2008 and 2009. So besides the impacts and outcomes that Jamie mentioned in her presentation around the social emotional outcomes and positive youth development outcomes and habits of mind that arts does, and the intrinsic value of arts for any individual, we really talk about how arts increases student engagement in school. It can contribute to a positive and stronger school climate and culture and sense of community, and then increase family and community engagement. And those are the reasons why we've always told people that Edvestors, as an education nonprofit, has been interested in focusing on arts education for all students. But then we always would get the question back from those who maybe were less inclined to support arts education. Well, how do you know after 3 years, or now looking at after 12 years, that you actually are having those impacts that you always talk about? And those of us in the arts ed field and those who have a practitioner background could say, well, I see it. I've seen theater students react, and you can see anecdotally the impact that having access to arts can have on individuals and on schools. But there was very limited research actually in the arts education field around really looking at the quantitative impacts of arts education next to some of the educational outcomes mentioned above. And so we were hoping that this study could strengthen case making and help inform policy and administrator-based decision-making around allocating resources to the arts. And it's important to note that because we have had such a strong partnership with BPS, Boston Public Schools, we were able, and that we've been consistently collecting arts access data as part of BPS arts expansion over the last 12 years now, around how much art students are actually getting during the school day. We were able to look at that data next to the educational data that the district was willing to share with us because of our partnership. And so we decided to undertake an arts data impact study, which was funded by the Barr Foundation and conducted by researchers Dr. Dan Bowen and Dr. Brian Casita from Texas A&M University and the University of Missouri, respectively, to really look at longitudinally arts education data and BPS data regarding student engagement, school climate, and traditional academic outcomes over time. So they really looked at over 1,500 variables and over 600,000 student level observations over 11 years. So the scale of this study was really something that isn't, for what I mentioned earlier, isn't possible for a lot of reasons in the arts field. And the study compares students to themselves at different points in time relative to the amount of arts they get. So this wasn't a randomized control trial where some students might be getting arts and some weren't, and then comparing them to each other, but really looking at changes within individual students. And so what did we find? So some of our high-level findings were really around that access to arts increases student engagement, especially as measured by positive effects on student attendance over the course of a school year, especially for students who are chronically absent and for students who have IEPs or individualized education plans, and that increased arts course taking also results in higher levels of parent engagement and in community engagement. And we were really happy to see these results because, again, anecdotally, we might see this, but the attendance results were pretty significant, especially those of you, I know many of you cover education issues, especially over the last year. The student engagement and absenteeism, especially chronic absenteeism, has been front of mind in terms of how students are engaged in the school day and whether they're chronically absent, especially during this past year of the pandemic. So what are the implications of this study? So again, we're hoping it provides strong quantitative student level evidence to strengthen case making and advocacy regarding arts education. Jamie just talked about ESSER funding and decisions that need to be made about how to allocate these resources that don't come around that often. And so how can we talk about arts education and decision-making and policy decisions around its impacts and what it can do for positive student outcomes, especially around student engagement and reducing absenteeism. It's also hopeful, we also hope that these findings could have resonance around establishing a foundation for future research around the impacts of arts education. And the research around the impacts of arts has gotten much more sophisticated over time. We're hoping this helps contribute to that. And that also here's some more quantitative evidence next to the qualitative stories that we know around how arts education can be a powerful strategy to strengthen student engagement, reduce chronic absenteeism, and create a stronger school climate. So that's a really high-level look at the study we released in May. And if you want to, there's a link to the brief here and my contact info for any further questions that may come up later. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That's really great information. And again, if anyone is interested in seeing this study, it should be in the chat. And we are also recording this so you can have access to this video and find all the hyperlinks there as well. We're going to move on to Michael. The pandemic and the move to remote instruction disrupted teaching and learning. As an educator at a performing arts school, can you tell us how you and your colleagues adapted your pedagogies to teach online? And how did students respond?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Isabel, for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to join these amazing colleagues in the arts. And you know, as an arts advocate for most of my career, you know, at teaching, et cetera, it's important to have these discussions. And thank you, Education Writers Association, for hosting this too. Thank you. So as we can all imagine, we're March 12th of last year. That was a Thursday. And you know, we're hearing about this virus. It's, you know, what's going on. You know, we're sort of planning our years, or you know, and then March 13th hits. Hey, we're in lockdown. You know, and all of our students and teachers and parents are immediately asked to pivot. And everyone thought it would just last for a few weeks. We're just going to get through this. And little did we know that this was going to be almost a year and a half until we were able to really start thinking about coming back. And in fact, you know, here in California, we're one of the few states that just kind of reopened all businesses, et cetera. And so we're thinking about, you know, how do we come back in the fall, starting in August, with our students and families in a way that's safe, as you mentioned, Jamie, about how do we make sure that we're paying attention to all the safety aspects of performing arts, music and dance, etc. Visual arts. In our school, we represent all of those arts very strongly as a specialized arts school. And so we have to think about those things. You know, we actually started coming back in a hybrid form back in April. 1 day a week, each department would come on campus to participate in arts in person. And that was a really interesting time to come back. So we not only had to pivot towards no, you know, in-person to in-person. So let's just go back though to how did we have to pivot our curriculum and our integration of arts into our students' lives when we were asked to kind of do this distance learning thing. And I think that the most difficult thing with the arts is that we ask an artist to have an artistic response to other people. Or if even in visual arts, your response is to the environment, is to your emotions and feelings in response to the world around you. And then when you're cut off in your house, in your room, from those stimuli, how are you interacting? If you're a musician, how are you able to interact with other musicians? That's an important part of our development as artists. Being a conductor and musician myself, you know, I miss very much being on the podium and interacting with people and that energy and exchange of ideas, feelings, energy. And how do we get that back for our students? So what I've done today is I've picked 5 different productions or little excerpts of productions that represent different ways that our students and faculty collaborated to produce art. How did we do that during the pandemic? How did we alter our teaching to accomplish that? So the first clip that I'm going to have us watch is a piece called Democracy, and it was our concert choir led by Dr. Alexander Blake, who he himself is really well known for his work with his professional group called Tonality here in Los Angeles, and they are mostly focused on issues of equity, social justice. And Dr. Blake has brought that into the classroom. And so this year in particular, he's had more time in the classroom to have discussions about what it means to be an artist citizen. What does it mean to use art to expand on equity and social justice? And so this particular piece, not only did they have to learn it through Zoom, through Google Classroom, but then they all had to record their part in a room without any other persons in the room and sing their part to like a click track so that we could coordinate that later. So imagine say you're, doing a dance number with other people and you're just going to do your one part, or you're doing like a duet on TikTok, right? You're watching someone else or something like that. These students have had to learn to coordinate their art exactly with other people without that artistic interaction. So this piece I want to watch with you, it's just a little clip, demonstrates one of the ways that a lot of schools found a solution to integrating lots of students, which is we call the Brady Bunch style of integrating our artists. So this is one. So let's watch Democracy and check it out. See how.
Democracy will not come today. It will not come this year nor ever through compromise and fear.
So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to watch all the excerpts. You can always find me and we can have a little party and do a little Zoom party if you want to watch all the excerpts. But you can see that's the kind of the typical thing that a lot of art schools did: orchestras, choirs, etc. We got an audio engineer and a video engineer, Final Cut Pro, and little boxes and rearranging the boxes, etc. And then we produce it. None of the students or faculty could actually see, is this going to turn out, until the end. So you see all the students learn their parts, sing it individually, and then we clump them together. So that's one way that students interacted. Another way, I'll take us to the next excerpt, is chamber music. How do you do chamber music when you're not sitting together in a room? This next excerpt is two of our graduating seniors doing a piano duet. And what they had to do is one person on the piano had to play their part perfectly, of course, and record that. And then the next person takes that and listens to it and learns every tiny nuance of tempo, expression, dynamics, etc., and literally absorbs all that information and practices with that in their ear over and over and over until it matches perfectly. And then they simply join together those two videos. And this was actually, our students did this on their own. The young woman in the video, Nicole Lamb, did quite a bit of video editing this year to help the piano department to fit together these videos. But there's no special effects here. These are students who learn their parts exactly and then married those together in an excerpt to perform a virtuosic piece. So this is called Danse Andalouse, and it's a piano duet. Take a look. It's particularly incredible just how virtuosic it is and how well it fits together. Moving on, though, we had an opportunity with the Music Center here in LA, one of the venerable arts institutions here. They do a yearly holiday celebration in which they invite professional and student organizations to participate in a show which actually goes international. It's distributed to all the performing schools as well as the military, etc. So it's seen around the world. Our school has been invited to participate for a number of years. And this year, what we had to do to pivot, this was back in December, is we created a hybrid situation where we recorded live bits and pieces of the piece. This is the prayer that is immortalized by Josh Groban. But we would record, safely distanced the string from the orchestra, the winds, the soloists of the singers, and the few choir members. And then all of that was married together in a video. So this is a little bit different than the sort of Brady Bunch style. This was actually an integrated video with a hybrid situation, but you can see the difference in the way and we put it together, kind of an evolution in the way that we had to respond to creating art. This is the prayer.
I pray you'll be our eyes.
I pray we'll find your
And
love
watch us where we go.
and hold it in our heart.
And help us to be
when the
wise.
stars go out each night.
Times where we don't know. Este es mi plegaria. Con toda mi fe.
With you, but we have to keep moving. But you can see that spot was the exact same place. In fact, it was a garage in East LA in Boyle Heights that had been converted into a studio, and they produced shows there every weekend. And so we collaborated with them, and you can see every single group is recorded in the same spot, magically fitted together for that production. So a beautiful representation there. Some of our students are very much involved in music technology and music tech, and the way that they create art is they write their own music, they sing, produce, and what they had to do to pivot was invite their own friends in their pod and their COVID pods to be dancers, videographers, editors, etc. So they sourced their own pod to create music videos, and this is the result of our music tech students' efforts. Clip number 4.
I don't wanna cry no more, and I don't wanna hear my mind talk. I don't wanna sit around thinking things have gone wrong.
Out of my mind, oh, am I out of my mind? Got no words, but I'll try. Oh, baby, I'm still standing, I'm still standing.
And yes, that was the same student singing, playing drums, playing guitar. He produced and edited the whole video, as all those students did. So this is one way that students created art during the pandemic. And while we had faculty working with them, one thing that I think was the most important thing this year was allowing art to be student-led. Projects that students could envision, create, and produce in a way that helped them to express what they were going through. The next project I want to point to is probably one of the most inventive of the whole school year. It's called the 7-Day Album Project. Our entire jazz department broke up into little pods, and they imagined, wrote, learned, recorded, and produced an album in 1 week, each one of them, of 3 to 5 songs. So this is just one tiny clip of one group that was inspired by Despicable Me, with the Minions and all that. They rewrote a music score to go along and edited the video to kind of tell a new story and to kind of reimagine what it might be with their own music. Really incredible, all student led. Clip number 5.
When I was young, I didn't need anyone, just my rocket ship. Oh, what a trip. I always felt like a disgrace. My mom said they don't send monkeys to space, but I grew stronger. You were there when I needed you most, and I still have the one thing I hold true, that it's apart and miles away.
Anyway, that's just a brief overview. I wish we had more time, but that's, you could see some of the incredible ways that students poured themselves into their art at our school. I could go on all day about how proud I am of them, but thank you so much for your time on that.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate that. And just to let anyone know who's watching, we are taking some live Q&A questions. So if you have any questions that you would like to submit to any of our panelists, please be sure to submit the questions in the question box. I do have some reporter-based questions for our panelists today. In my reporting, I have heard from both teachers and mental health professionals that the hardest part of bringing students back is reteaching them how to have structure and focus. So this question is geared towards Michael as an arts teacher. What advice or techniques from art practices do you think educators can utilize to help kids relearn how to focus?
Excellent. You know, it's difficult. Most students have been on Zoom or some platform similar to that. And the woe that most teachers have had is the blank screen, you know, turning the screen off, and you're teaching to a room full of blank screens. That's very, very difficult. So as we come back in person, I think some of the most important ways is to get students working together in pods on art that they can imagine or that they can pour their own emotion in. For instance, like if you can create small groups, I did that even in my music theory classes where I had students imagine, hey, what kind of music do you identify with personally? Whether it's a type of music like Hawaiian music or house music or hip hop. And I want you to investigate that type of music and see how it influences other types of music, etc. So I gave them kind of a wide scope. And by kind of making art student-centric, allowing them to explore, giving them things that pique their own curiosity about art, that draws them in. It helps to focus. It helps them to say, aha, this is relevant to me, my experience, my identity. When we can create art and interactions with art that matters to the students, then honestly, that's not even a question. The students engage because they see themselves in the art when we present those opportunities. That's my short answer.
Thank you so much, Michael. Another question that I had, this one is geared to Jamie. Many students have suffered trauma, not only from the isolation from the pandemic, but some communities were under stress due to racial or economic inequities, and others lost family members to COVID-19. How can arts education help in healing the trauma students underwent?
Yeah, you know, interesting to me that we don't seem to be asking that same question of science teachers, for example, or of math teachers, for example. And I think the difference is, just like Michael was talking about, you know, students take in information about their world, they step into their arts classroom, and then their responsibility as an artist is to make sense of all that information and put it back out into the world in a new format. And so the arts classroom can absolutely be a place where we help students work through that trauma through the artistic process. I want to be careful though, because arts therapy is a separate field, and we can't expect teachers to be therapists, and they can't be therapists. However, there are two things that we can do. Number one, it is absolutely appropriate for teachers to be trained to use therapy strategies in an education setting. And that is a great use of ESSER funds, specifically those professional development funds. And the second is that we can pay for arts therapists to actually provide services to students. And that is another allowable expense under ESSER.
Thank you, Jamie. And this is a question that goes towards Michael. We've talked a little bit about inequities. Your school is a selective specialized high school, and thinking about how arts education sometimes can exacerbate racial or economic inequity, what is the school doing to rethink inequity in arts education and to make it more accessible, especially to like communities that might not have access to arts education?
It's such an important question right now. You know, imagine yourself growing up in LA in school districts that don't have strong arts programs or have no arts programs. You know, some of the students that come to LACHSA in the past, you know, they've benefited from having access to arts early in their childhood, from kindergarten onwards. Doesn't mean necessarily their family had money, but they were in a school district that had arts. So LACHSA is unique in that we source students from all over the county of Los Angeles. You know, and county of Los Angeles has 8 or 9 million people. So students actually come from sometimes even hours away. They'll leave their houses at 6:30 in the morning to get to us. So there are many different equity issues at play here. But some specific things that we've done this year to really look at those questions, to see what are our demographics, how can we do even better to invite students not only from all over the county, but to get arts training earlier into other schools. So it starts with, I think it starts with earlier arts training, bridge programs. I can point to several initiatives, but one in particular, to keep it brief, is an initiative that we're working with Inner City Arts in South Los Angeles right now to build a bridge program that will start in 6th grade and give opportunity for integration and collaboration of our teaching artists with students at Inner City Arts. So both LACHSA teachers and Inner City Arts teachers, and an integrated curriculum in which we imagine that giving more arts training and specific arts training that is geared towards a life in art, or at least a path towards LACHSA or other art schools like Ramon Cortinas or Colburn. I think Los Angeles is particularly blessed in arts education as compared to other cities, because there are other bridge programs and arts programs led and spearheaded by LA Philharmonic. We have the YOLA, we have Harmony Project, there's HOLA, which is part of Los Angeles. There's the Neighborhood Music School in East LA. So my job this last year, in fact, it's my first year at LACHSA, I have gone out with our equity coordinator, who was hired this year as well, to reach back out and to create new partnerships and new connections to all of these programs to say, how can we give more resources and create partnerships and collaborations that will get more students into LACHSA. Now, getting into LACHSA, that's the next part of it. I looked at the admissions part of my own department and said, hey, what here might be a barrier to entry? Because we do have an admissions process, which is unique for many high schools. Most, you know, don't have that sort of structure. I looked at things even like, how are we keeping students out? If you want to flip it on its head, rather than how are we getting students in? And I looked at, you know, the type of art that we were requiring students to play. For instance, if you wanted to get into our piano program in the past, you were required to play a Bach Prelude and Fugue, you were going to play Chopin, or you're going to play Liszt or Haydn or Mozart. And these were all very Eurocentric male composers that they were part of the canon. And I challenged that. I said, well, I believe that we can ask students to play any two pieces that represent themselves artistically and culturally and with their own identity. Hey, play something that's slow and expressive, one piece, and then play something that's faster, maybe a little more technical to show us your technique. And that's it. Hey, and then we asked for a personal statement, a video rather than a written statement. Tell us who you are and why art is important to you as a young artist. And then get a recommendation from a community mentor. It could be someone in their church. It could be somebody at their school. It didn't have to be a musician, in other words. So what I would try to do is just make sure that there was a way for students to represent who they are and why they wanted to access a life in arts. And I completely revised the entire admissions process for the music department to make it more equitable, to make it more fair and culturally even-handed for students from all backgrounds to be able to get into LACHSA. And so we instituted that this year, and we'll continue looking at that process and not being afraid to question year after year, how can we help more students to access arts training, either through LACHSA or in our community at large?
Thank you so much, Michael. And I actually want to direct the same question to Ruth. How is your nonprofit working with BPS to advance equity in arts education? And how are you thinking about what equity means in arts education settings? I can hear you. You're on.
All right, great. Thank you. I think there was tech issues there, but thank you for this important question. Equity is obviously a priority around our BPS arts expansion work, where we're really looking at arts access across all schools. And then also we've been working closely with BPS, the Visual and Performing Arts department, around professional development for arts teachers and teaching artists around culturally responsive instruction and defining that, and also prior to supporting the district in their efforts around decolonizing the arts curriculum for all arts educators, which is really looking at each discipline very closely, what is being taught, who is teaching it, and why, and also amplifying student voice, as Michael gave some great powerful examples of that, around students centering their what they want to learn and their backgrounds and identities around the learning that they do in the classroom. And through our BPS Arts Expansion grant making, we actually are prioritizing projects. We're just announcing over $400,000 in grants actually this week to support projects in BPS with arts teachers and arts partners around culturally responsive instruction and racial equity as priorities.
Thank you, Ruth. And this is kind of, we're down to about 5 minutes. So this is kind of a lightning round of questions, but this is for everyone. What kinds of arts education stories would you like to see more journalists covering? So we're going to start with Jamie and just go down the line.
Yeah, for me, it is debunking or redirecting the conversation that we have found ourselves having since No Child Left Behind. And that is any story that doesn't rely on the arts as a tool to raise standardized test scores. I would love to see more writing about the value of the arts in and of themselves and the unique value that they have for children rather than how they help raise test scores.
And what about you, Michael? What stories would you like to see journalists performing? Is it not working? Oh, you're muted? Okay. Ruth, we'll go with you next. What stories would you like to see journalists doing that has to do with arts education?
I think really looking at the impact of arts, acknowledging the intrinsic value of the arts in and of themselves, but also looking at the intersections of how the arts really can impact so many positive educational outcomes for students, whether it's around workforce development, looking at racial equity and justice. There are so many cities across the country that have really chosen to prioritize the arts as a lever to help students improve students' overall education. And how do we highlight those best practices, especially during this time with this infusion of ESSER funding, as something that should really be invested in?
I'm unmuted now. Sorry, for some reason the computer thought I should be silenced. Couple ideas on this. You know, one thing that's occurred to me just for my years of just being the leader of ensembles and wanting to get the word out about wonderful arts projects. It might seem like a simple thing, but a lot of schools don't know how to do that very well. They don't have marketing departments. They don't have somebody who writes, knows the community at large. And so, you know, reaching out to schools who typically have great art projects going on, or forging connections to arts leaders and arts schools so that we can get the word out to the public. You know, one big initiative this coming year for our school is how can we make more of an impact in the communities at large with the art, not insulating on our campus. So we need actually collaboration with media in order to get the word out so that we can have those audiences, we can make the impact. Our opera program this year, for instance, is doing this wonderful outreach project with an opera called Pepito. It's about a dog who they assume is stupid because it doesn't respond to anyone's commands. But the problem is, he just speaks Spanish. And he can't understand the owners. So we're using that as a way to say, hey, you know, there are differences, and how do we bridge language barriers and differences in our community? And so, you know, we're finding ways to create projects that really will be fun and interactive with our communities and with schools around the art. And so, you know, again, like partnering up with schools who do outreach and do projects to impact their community is really a great way to get the word out and to change our culture for people to seek out art and culture at our school level and to support our arts programs.
Thank you, Michael. And we have a question from the audience. I'm going to direct it towards Jamie. It is from Menachem Wecker. Given how much of a focus in the arts world writ large currently is to step away from roles of gatekeepers and lectures and to allow things to happen organically in community sans chaperone, are we approaching a time when it makes sense to take a lot of the benefits you've all discussed out of a school context and to have them organically happen with students in their own neighborhoods and communities, or would that be a mistake?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, that would be a mistake to solely move them out of schools and into communities. I would much prefer that we do a yes and approach. And the reason is, you know, public school is an opportunity that is afforded every child in this country. That is not necessarily the case in every community across the country. And so if we take arts out of schools and put them into communities, there are going to be some children that don't have access at all. And I realize that already happens in schools. But at least we have an opportunity to provide an equitable arts education for every child. So I would love to see us actually double down in the school setting, make sure that every child has access to the basics, and then leverage our community partners to really build on that and make it a true partnership between our community-based organizations and our schools, rather than one or the other.
Absolutely, I would agree with Jamie on that. Just real quick, another way that we can kind of have the institution support students who want to do work in their community to use their art is to help them to create their own outreach projects, support them, create the connections, give them resources, and this is a way for our students who have a lot to offer to inspire other children. But I don't think we should only move that out into the communities. It should be included in our arts education and our arts leadership training.
Well, I'm going to pop in here because we are out of time today, but thank you to our guests, Jamie, Ruth, Michael, and Isabel, for that wonderful and incredibly informative conversation. As Isabel reminded everyone, this was recorded, so it should be on our website in the next 24 to 48 hours. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees and EWA members who joined us today. As soon as the webinar closes, you are going to get an evaluation survey, and we ask that you please complete it. Your feedback is really important to us and helps us improve. So make sure you visit ewa.org to sign up for more upcoming webinars, and one day in-person seminars will happen again. And thank you again, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.